Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be talking about the Middle Kingdom of ancient Egypt in our continuing study of the history of civilization. We've noted already that in Egyptian history we started with the Archaic period, that was the first and second dynasty, and then dynasties 3 through 6, that's the Old Kingdom, that's the pyramid era, when all the pyramids are built. Remember, we said that they're mostly built on the west side of the Nile. But then there's a intermediate period where everything falls apart. Egypt as a unified country actually just fell apart. It disintegrated. But that's okay, because now we're going to come back. We're going to resuscitate. We're going to resurrect the kingdom of Egypt. And this is going to be the Middle Kingdom, especially dynasties 11 and 12. And this is going to be the era of where we'll see the biblical patriarchs. Now, in that intermediate period, Egypt had fallen apart, and as it comes back now, we actually have two dynasties ruling together. The 10th dynasty is actually ruling in northern Egypt. Remember, we call that Lower Egypt because it's down closer to sea level. And then to the south, we have the 11th dynasty ruling Upper Egypt, even though it's down on a map, that's Upper Egypt. But what's going to happen is that the 10th dynasty is going to sort of fade away or be overthrown, and the 11th dynasty is now going to come back and reunify all of Egypt. This will be the beginning of the Middle Kingdom of Egypt. It's during this period, the Middle Kingdom, that we're going to see Abraham. Remember, he comes and he visits Egypt because there's a famine in Canaan. And he comes and he does that thing, she's not my wife, she's my sister, and interacts with the Pharaoh. And then he leaves and goes back to Canaan. Later, maybe 100 or so years later, you have Joseph being sold as a slave into Egypt. And eventually the Israelites are going to migrate. This little tribe of Israelites, at this point there are only 70 some people, but they're going to come and move down into Egypt. One of the names we want to talk about, probably the only name we're going to discuss as we look at the Middle Kingdom, is Menem III, and since there's several of them, we're going to call him the third. He oversees the irrigation of a canal to the Fayum Depression. There's actually a place that's even lower than sea level, just to the west of the Nile, and he's going to have this idea, just if we could put water in that, then maybe we could begin irrigation and we could turn that all into farmland. It's one of the driest, most desolate places on the face of the earth. The other thing he does is we actually have records of the recording of the height of the Nile, because this is going to become a concern. It's during his reign that we see for a time the annual floods fail. And that's disaster for Egypt, because if the river doesn't rise, we think usually in our Western culture, the rising river, flooding river, that's terrible. No, that's a good thing. In Egypt, if the river doesn't rise, it doesn't deliver that topsoil that's delivered each year, and the crops won't grow as well. And the desert's gradually going to reclaim that Nile River basin, and so the floods don't come for a time, not just a year, and remember, the Bible talks about how in the days of Joseph that he has a dream where the Pharaoh has a dream, and it's a sign that there's going to be some bad times, some 7 years of famine. Now, it's around this time that we have recorded the entry of Asiatic people in what's called the Beni Hasan tomb. This is a tomb down in the Amarna area. It's not in Amarna, but it depicts, notice I've got two layers, and this is an artist's reproduction of that wall painting. The wall painting itself is in terrible shape. It's sort of patchy, but you can make up bits and pieces. And so there's a reproduction of that wall painting. And notice on the bottom tier, we have Egyptians pictured. That's how they drew themselves. And then on the top tier, we have some other peoples, and they look different, and they dress different. Notice they've got beards. The Egyptians are clean shaven. Yes, they might have the ceremonial beard that they wear, but these other people, they just let their hair grow. And what's wrong with them? They're not conforming to the styles. They've got these multicolored arraiments that they're wearing, and they're coming into Egypt. Now, the Bible talks about the coming of Semitic peoples as well, who are allowed to, in the book of Genesis, they're allowed to settle in the land of Goshen. It's mentioned again in the book of Exodus, how they are still there. This land on the east side of the Nile Delta. It's the back door to Egypt. Anybody coming to Egypt from the outside, unless they're coming down the Nile River from Cush way to the south, they're not going to come across the desert, but they are going to come through Goshen. So that's the doorway to Egypt, and the Israelites have been allowed to settle there according to the biblical story. It's natural to assume that there was going to be a level of suspicion against the Israelites. And we read about that in the early chapters of the book of Exodus. First of all, because they were foreigners, and let's just face it, the Egyptians were not particularly fond of foreigners. I'm not sure if a lot of cultures are, but the Egyptians in particular, they weren't fond of foreigners at all. And the fact that the Israelites were shepherds was another strike against them. The Egyptians, if you were a foreigner, that was bad enough. But if you were a shepherd on a foreigner, that was really bad. And here they were in the land of Goshen, the back door to Egypt, the doorway by which any old person could come in, and they're exercising more and more control over that door, or at least the threat is there that they might. And of course, there's religious differences, and all of these are going to add up to there being an anti-Israelite sentiment. And we read about a king and maybe even a dynasty that comes up, and they don't remember Joseph, they don't know Joseph, they don't want anything to do with Joseph and his people, and they're going to be against the Israelites. And so the Israelites are going to find themselves under bondage, and it's going to be a bondage of hostility at the hands of the Egyptians. The Middle Kingdom of Egypt was considered by the Egyptians themselves as the Golden Age. I would have picked probably the early kingdom, the Old Kingdom, the time of the pyramids. But the Egyptians themselves looked back at the Middle Kingdom as their Golden Age. And yet, toward its close, there was a new group that found themselves coming into Egypt. They are known to history as the Hyksos. And they move into Egypt. Did they come as invaders? Did they come as immigrants turned invaders? We're not entirely sure, and there's arguments both ways. The term Hyksos, actually that's a term that's used by other people. They are described by the Egyptians as rulers of foreign lands. They are described by Josephus, that he says this term means shepherd kings. We're not sure that it does, or that they had anything to do with shepherds. But this group comes in, and they're not Egyptian. They are Semitic peoples. They have Semitic terms that they use. They worship Semitic gods like Baal. Sounds very Canaanite. And they come into Egypt, and they manage to take over not all of Egypt, but just northern Egypt. In southern Egypt, the nobles of Thebes, they continue to hold on to southern Egypt. And so we have Egypt divided again. And this is going to be the second intermediate period where, again, Egypt is a divided nation. But this time the Egyptians have, the Hyksos have brought a new weapon. They have brought the composite bow, but especially they have brought the chariot. Now you say, wait a minute, chariots were around a long time before. Well, they were, but not with the spoked wheel. And that's going to make all the difference in the world, because this is a very light chariot. A person can actually pick it up. It's that light. And horses can move it extremely fast, and it will revolutionize ancient warfare.